Our circumstances today have something in common with the world in the years following 1971. Economies then were in turmoil. The institutions governing international finance were failing the test of crisis. And wherever one looked around the world, there was trouble. So it is today. The latest crisis hit as the world was grappling already with enormous challenges: large current account imbalances, aging populations in advanced countries, violence, terrorism, and, of course, the eternal problems of poverty and underdevelopment. There's always something, but we must never stop trying to improve the state of the world. Therefore, in June, when Canada hosts the leaders of the G20 and the G8 in Toronto and Muskoka, respectively, our goal is to work with our partners towards practical and durable solutions. Let me first talk about the G20 itself, which at Pittsburgh we officially designated as the world's premier forum for economic cooperation. In that role, the G20 will stand or fall on its ability to demonstrate in the months to come the same cooperative spirit it has shown over the past year. Now, I am hopeful. Beginning in Washington in November 2008, G20 leaders have responded to the systemic financial collapse and the global recession with quick, decisive, and coordinated action. At the London Summit in April 2009, these measures were expanded with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable states, so that in Pittsburgh, the seeds of a new era of balanced, sustainable growth were planted. If I may be indulged in a personal recollection, what I saw at the Washington Summit made an enormous impression on me. Nations whose interests have often been at odds, nations with different traditions of governance, rivals, even former enemies, found themselves addressing common problems with a common will. In this globalized economy, they recognized that a flood engulfing one would soon swamp them all. So even though 20-some leaders all represented sovereign states, they agreed to common and synchronized actions to chart the same course toward calmer waters. Ideological differences were set aside, old enmities were not raised. I would say this: if you had arrived from another planet, you could never have guessed which nations had spent decades mired in hostility. Now, you might call it the fellowship of the lifeboat. But, ladies and gentlemen, in that brief parting of the veil, I saw world leadership at its best, a glimpse of a hopeful future, one where we act together for the good of all, the world we have been trying to build since 1945, the world we want for our children and grandchildren. It shows it can be done if we act together, and I call this enlightened sovereignty. And I believe our understanding in Washington, just in Washington, allowed us to avoid the cataclysm that otherwise really would have come to pass. But an agreement to act is just a start. It is acting on the agreement that matters. So when the G20 resumes in Toronto, the discussion should be less about new agreements than accountability for existing ones, less about lofty promises than real results, less about narrow self-interest in sovereignty's name than an expanded view of mutual interest in which there is room for all to grow and prosper. Enlightened sovereignty, then, the natural extension of enlightened self-interest. I suspect every single person in this room understands that the growth in global trade has been largely responsible for wealth creation worldwide in the past generation. And therefore, enhancing trade and resisting protectionism is both essential to the world economy and to the just cause of raising millions of people from poverty. The G20 has said this at every single meeting. Of course, there have been national actions, maybe too many, that detract from that goal. Even so, we have thus far avoided anything like the protectionism that turned the stock market crash of 1929 into a decade-long depression. In Canada, we have continue to try to be leaders in promoting free trade and open markets. Our stimulus package, I should mention, did not raise tariffs. It lowered them, unilaterally, I might add. Since 2006, we have concluded free trade agreements with 8 additional countries, and we are engaged in 6 other negotiations, including with the European Union. We will continue to promote trade. We will continue to resist protectionism and to reduce and eliminate tariff barriers. However, at Pittsburgh last year, the G20 went beyond merely advocating for trade and against protectionism as a basis for promoting global growth. We also established what we christened the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Much of what the framework prescribes takes us in the right direction. I speak especially of consensus at the macro level on the causes of the recession and the mutual commitment among G20 members to coordinate their policies. However, this is where G20 partners must truly embrace enlightened views of sovereign behavior. Otherwise, we will pursue strategies, inevitably, that do not produce mutual advantage and therefore cannot be sustained. Like, drop your tariffs, I'll keep mine, or let your currency trade at market rates, we'll keep ours undervalued. We should know from the terrible experience of the 1930s that strategies that make it difficult for somebody to do business inevitably make it difficult for everybody to do business. So I say, notions rooted in a narrow view of sovereignty and national self-interest must be reconsidered. We cannot do business as though, for one to have more, another must have less. That is not true, it is not just, and it cannot be the path we take. Our ambition, the necessary condition for success as the G20 moves forward, must be a shared belief that the rising tide of recovery must lift all boats, not just some. This is the exercise of sovereignty at its most enlightened. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with the G20 necessarily focused on the economy, there does remain, in our view, an important role for the G8 group of nations, the group of 8 nations, in non-economic matters, in promoting democracy and development, peace and security. In this troubled world, we clearly recognize how much else there is that requires international cooperation. Terrorism threatens all of us. Piracy has returned to strategic seaways. Climate change disproportionately threatens the peoples least capable of adapting to it. And although tensions between the older nuclear states have largely dissipated, the spread of nuclear weapons to new actors allows the world no relief from anxiety. These are all complex, daunting threats that cannot be met by any one country working alone. They require the close cooperation of friends and like-minded allies. On these, the G8 can show leadership. As an example, let us close with something where progress is possible if we are willing. It concerns the link between poverty and the appalling mortality among mothers and small children in the third world. Did you know that every year over 500,000 women die in pregnancy and nearly 9 million children die before their 5th birthday? The numbers should shock and grieve us. Far too many lives and futures are being lost. And to the world's shame, so many have been lost for want of relatively simple health solutions, all within the reach of the international community. Often the keys of life are no more sophisticated than clean water, widely available vaccines, or the most basic treatment against infection. That so little has been done is tragic. It is not just about words on a page. It is real hunger, real suffering, real people dying. Canada takes its development commitments seriously, including those made at the G8. That's why, for example, we have double aid to Africa as promised, and we are on track with our commitment to double international assistance this year. So what is required to fight this particular problem of human misery? It is merely the same unity of purpose that we can find within ourselves readily enough when disaster strikes, as it recently did in Haiti, or as we can and do when the problem is one of trade, finance, or the economy. We must find that unity of purpose. It is therefore time to mobilize for friends and partners to do something for those who can do little for themselves, to replace grand good intentions with substantive acts of human goodwill. We must bring a sense of shared responsibility. We must be pragmatic, focused, and above all, encourage accountability. The G20 nations must fully deliver on the commitments they have made. The Group of 8 must live up to their promises. Accountability, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, is the prerequisite for progress. As host of the G8 and the G20 meetings this June, Canada will use its leadership role to focus on these challenges. And I look forward to collaborating closely with our international partners as we continue to support the economic recovery and chart new beginnings for humanity worldwide. Thank